Okay. Thanks everyone for coming along. Welcome to this sort of DECRA information session. It's kind of one of the two things that we do in the faculty to try and help DECRA participants. So the first one today, and then later in the week, I'll be running sort of first page information sessions for everyone, and I'll come to kind of what a first page is and what we mean by that, and why it's important a little bit later on. I already had a question about that just earlier on. So we've got sort of, this is going to take place in two parts. I will shortly start sharing my screen. Basically, if you've got any questions, you're welcome to chime in or put them in the chat. I'll try and keep track of them as best I can. I guess I'll ask, if you're not asking a question, maybe pop your microphone off and your screen off. Your camera off, just so that we can make sure we don't run into any kind of bandwidth limitations and that everything comes through nice and clean. And then the little sort of caveat that I'll put on top of this, I guess there's two little caveats. One is that my house is dominated by my cats, and so I may end up running back and forth from doors here and there. The second caveat is that this year's kind of been a very weird year. I'll come to what we know about how that's in fact affecting the DECRA process a little bit later on. But what I've put together is the information as best I can gather it, particularly where it's the detailed information about particular sections and what exactly those sections are going to take. I couldn't find the instructions to applicants for the coming round. And so they may be coming out with some adjustments a little bit later on. We've already seen the deadlines shift once in response to the COVID pandemic. And so some of the information that I provide in the detailed first section might end up being a little bit out of date as the ARC updates. So if you need to verify something, the Faculty Research Office or the Monash Research Office are the source of wisdom. The Monash Research Office are allowed to contact the ARC directly to answer questions if they don't have the answers, whereas I can't do that. So most of my information comes from the website, which is usually reliable, but it's kind of a rapidly changing time at the moment. So with those caveats aside, what I'm going to try and do is give you kind of the best overview I can of what putting together a DECRA kind of looks like. And so I'm going to do this workshop in two sections. So we've got through till 5 booked. I don't know if it'll take that long, but it also gives us plenty of chance for questions and things like that afterwards if we have them. So the first section is really just about the nuts and bolts of a DECRA application. So it's about what the ARC system seeks to achieve, what the timelines are, what they're looking for in the application in terms of how the different points and scores are awarded, and the various bits and bobs that go into it. So this section might be useful for everyone. It's designed to be particularly useful for those who aren't familiar with the ARC system, just to bring you up to speed with how it works. Because it kind of, understanding exactly how it works gives you an idea about what kind of pitch to put together and helps you understand what they're looking for. The second part, which will probably be the longer part, is about how do you actually go about assembling a DECRA and making it as competitive as you possibly can. So I'm going to draw on some expertise from 2 members of the College of Experts. The College of Experts is very important in terms of deciding which grants get funded and which grants don't. There's a administering organisation statement that needs to be put together, so you'll need to develop that. And then how you go about assembling the project description, your research opportunity, outputs and performance evidence, the budget, and all the other bits and pieces of the grant. So the second part is much more about how you go about writing one to be as good as it possibly can. Okay. So the DECRA scheme sits within the entire sort of ARC National Competitive Grants Program. Now the grants program is divided up into 2 components, the discovery component and the linkage component. So the discovery component is designed to support fundamental research. So if you're not an applied researcher, I'm not an applied researcher, it tends to be the discovery component of the National Competitive Grants Program that you go to. And so this program recognises that fundamental research is important to Australia's innovation, to develop new ideas, create new jobs, economic growth, and enhance quality of life in Australia. And so over the 2019 to 2020 financial year, $508 million were allocated to it. And the allocation for the Discovery Program, or for the ARC, sits in the forward estimates for the budget. And so it's unlikely, probably very unlikely, to be affected by the economic downturn that we're currently experiencing associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's likely that, very likely that these sorts of schemes will continue into the future. And then the second part of the ARC program is the linkage. So linkage is designed to form collaborations between universities and industry, between universities and the government, and to sort of develop more of the sort of commercial type R&D. But it's really, linkage is really about partnerships. So as an example, the Centre of Excellence scheme is the biggest, most substantial funding scheme in the ARC. So those grants are $30 million for 7 years, or roundabout. And that will include a lot of fundamental research and then some industry linkages and some translation. So it's the linkage scheme that really supports that getting things to the marketplace type research. So there's a whole series of different schemes that sit under there. But just to give you an example of how much it's about partnerships, the linkage infrastructure, equipment and facility schemes is about universities and the government co-funding the purchase of substantial pieces of equipment. And that could be for discovery research as well. So the reason I'm sort of going through this bit is to sort of reassure everyone that the government does care about fundamental research. And if your research is fundamental, there is a place for you in the sort of DECRA scheme. And so DECRA sits underneath that discovery program. So the DECRA scheme is an element of the discovery program, and it's designed to provide research support for early career researchers in teaching and research only positions. So one of the things that you'll see when these are announced every year is there will be academics on continuing jobs who are receiving funding through the scheme. That often causes a little bit of concern in terms of whether that's really what the scheme's for, but it is explicitly designed for people in teaching and research positions and research only positions. It's basically, if you're within 5 years of PhD, allowing for career interruptions, and this year allowing for COVID, you're eligible to apply. So there will be junior or early career academics, as well as early career postdocs and recent PhD graduates competing for this. But a really important element of it is the assessment relative to opportunity. So the assessment relative to opportunity will be different for those folks at different career stages. And the College of Experts take that stuff really seriously. So if you have an award of a PhD in accordance with the grant opportunity eligibility dates, or if you've got a career interruption, you're eligible to apply. It's only that timescale which dictates eligibility. And they typically go for about 200 3-year DECRAs every year, and these include up to 50 grand in project funds. So it's designed to provide a salary, or it's designed to provide most of a salary. The university will typically top up what the ARC doesn't pay for, and some research costs. Whoops, wrong with that. So the DECRA scheme is designed to support excellent basic and applied research. So it covers that full spectrum. It supports national and international research collaboration. So these are the stated objectives from that website, or from that URL there, of the DECRA scheme. So it's worth bearing these in mind when you're thinking about how you might put it together. So the first point, excellent basic and applied research. Second point, national and international research collaboration. So that collaboration is quite high in this list of things that the DECRA is designed to do. And that kind of makes sense because this is it's a career development grant. It's designed to help each of you move to the next stage of your career, and forming fruitful and effective collaborations is an important part of that. It's also designed to enhance the scale and focus of research in Australian government priority areas, advance promising early career researchers and promote enhanced opportunities, and enable research and research training in high quality and supportive environments. So that research and research training might be training that you receive. It could also be training that you provide for PhD students or for honours students or for undergraduates. And so this gives you an overview of what the target of this scheme is, what it's trying to achieve. So when you're putting your application together, you want to be thinking about what the scheme is trying to achieve and how what you're planning to do aligns with that. So for example, where you see the enhance the scale and focus of research in Australian government priority areas, normally what I would do if we were in a room here is I would ask how many people know what the Australian government priority areas are. Typically, very few people do. And so because you now know that this is part of the DECRA scheme, it's worth going and checking what they are, understanding what those priority areas are. Okay, so key dates. So there's a series of dates that will need to be hit through this process, and they're spread out between now and when it goes to the ARC. So the first is a career interruption form. So by September 30, you'll want to have submitted a career interruption form if you have a PhD that was awarded prior to 1st of March 2016. So that 1st March 2016 currently defines the 5-year window. So if you have a PhD before that, it means you're outside of that 5-year window. That's allowable with career interruptions, but there is a way of formally checking and documenting those career interruptions. So if that applies to you, you will want to use that form to make sure that those are documented so that you're able to apply. And this is dealing with the eligibility to apply, not the performance relative to opportunity if you've had career interruptions in this window. This is just documenting that you are allowed to apply even though your PhD was before that date. And so these dates are listed as important dates on the ARC website. Is DE21 still open? DE20, so the DE21s are they the ones that were announced earlier? I'm actually finding it, oh, I see, whoops. I'm finding it quite difficult to keep track of the names of the DE21 and DE22 at the moment. So I think the DE21 should be closed now, and so we're coming up to the next DE22 round because the funding starts on 1st of January 2022 for applications that go in later in this year. Does that address the question? You can just chime in if you like, Tess, if that's easier.
Sorry, yeah, I'm not sure. This is why I emailed somebody earlier today, because my PhD was in May 2015.
Yep.
So that would exclude me from 2022 unless there's this COVID thing.
Yes. So this would be if you were in the last year of eligibility for the next round.
Yeah, but I'm out of eligibility for the next round already.
Yes.
So my question.
So there is no round currently open. There's a round under assessment currently.
Yep.
The next round to open is the ones which will go in November, which have the 1st March 2016.
Right, so I've kind of already missed the boat.
Unless you have career interruptions, yes.
How long would the interruption have to be?
For May, 9 months or so. 10
yeah,
months.
about a 9 months.
So there are a series of circumstances that are documented on the ARC webpage or in the funding rules about what different events qualify for. So some based on illness and things, and they might need to be documented in a different way, but there are sort of for moves and things like that, there are standard periods which apply. So it's worth making sure you know the ins and outs of all of those to check.
Yeah, because I'm feeling like I've kind of missed the boat here, which, yeah, okay, I'll have a look.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, Tess, I'm not able to answer that one. That sounds like to me that's a really good one for MRO, because where there's ambiguity, they can access the ARC.
Okay, great, thank you.
No worries. Brian, oh, how I wish I knew, I guess is my answer to that question. So the question is, for those who obtained PhDs in 2017, will we be able to apply for career interruptions in the future related to COVID? I would suggest the answer is yes. This year, they've got a specific extra year of eligibility, which they've added on for basically people who are making their run right now to go towards application in the round which closes at the end of this year and have been disrupted because of that. So they're adding an extra year of eligibility. I would think that career, so certainly for performance relative to opportunity, COVID will absolutely count for that. How COVID is dealt with regard to career interruptions, I suspect will be a case by case. Some people may be, or some people are definitely more affected than others. And it's going to depend on circumstances. So I would expect that COVID-related interruptions will be on the radar for the future. I don't know whether this flat out, this sort of, I didn't want to call it a bonus year. I don't know if anyone would ever call 2020 a bonus year. I don't know if this extra year of eligibility associated with COVID will happen in future rounds as well. I'm not sure how it's going to play out. But I will talk a little bit later about picking your time, given that you're only allowed to apply twice. Okay. So I don't know. So there was a big flood happened in chemistry a couple of years ago. I remember that flood. And one lab was greatly affected. I don't know if that would count as a career interruption, but those kind of things are what the career interruption forms are designed to address. So the career interruption forms exist so that you can have a ruling on career interruptions that's unambiguous. So again, I would probably check that one with MRO. Okay, so once we get past the career interruption forms, we then move on to the first thing that's due is strategic statements. So strategic statements document the university's perspective on your performance and the value that you bring. These strategic statements need to go to the Monash Research Office on November 11, but they can't go to MRO until they've been approved by me. And so we will have a faculty deadline for strategic statements, which will be 2 weeks prior to that. So that deadline gives me an opportunity to review the strategic statements and approve them so they can be sent off to MRO. You have the opportunity to, by November 4, submit a request not to assess for, excuse me. So the request not to assess form allows you to exclude up to 3 reviewers without having to justify why you're excluding them. So if you have mortal enemies in science elsewhere, or people who you think are unlikely to view your work favorably, or competitors, people you've had particular experiences with, you can exclude up to 3 without having to give a reason. You can exclude more, but you start needing to require justification for why those individuals are excluded. And if you would like to exclude a member of the College of Experts, you always have to provide a justification. So make use of the request not to assess form if there are people you would rather not have assess your grant, or if you would like the peace of mind of just excluding people that you might be worried about. So do we report career interruptions even when within the 5-year deadline? So for that career interruption form, it's about assessing your eligibility to apply. So career interruptions within that 5-year window, if they would alter your eligibility, would be documented. If they don't alter your eligibility, you would typically not need to, or you wouldn't need to submit the career interruption form because you'd still be eligible to apply. Then you would document your career interruptions in the grant itself so that people could, the assessors and the college could assess your opportunity relative to your performance relative to opportunity. So the career interruption form is about making sure that you're eligible to apply. But if you're 3 years from PhD and you've had 1 year of career interruption, that doesn't alter your eligibility because you're still within 5 years of application, or in 5 years of PhD. So you're eligible to apply, but you would document that as part of your performance. Okay. And then on October 28, we come to the initial deadline for review by the Monash Research Office. So I would encourage everyone to be working towards that target, even though the ARC deadline is a solid month later. The MRO, if you get it to them nice and early, can provide feedback. Probably the most important feedback they'll provide is whether you're likely to breach any eligibility requirements. They will tell you if they think your font is too small, or if your margins are too small, or if you've done something that they think will lead to your grant being rejected without review because it breaches eligibility. There is also the medical research policy, which dictates whether a grant is considered to be medical research or not medical research, and they can provide advice with making sure you don't inadvertently breach that if your research lies on the border. And it is worth giving them the time to do that. We did a few years ago, there was one grant that was rejected by the ARC on the basis of breaching the medical research policy. It was considered too medical for the ARC, and so got rejected on those grounds without review. So you want to make sure that the Monash Research Office have the opportunity to check for those kind of requirements. Then on the 25th, things need to go to the ARC, 25th of November, things need to go to the ARC and the certification form, which dictates that the university and the head of school are willing to support it and things like that. That all needs to go to the Monash Research Office. And do try and get it, a day or two before that. We do have, from time to time, we're on the phone trying to catch people who haven't clicked the last button to submit it to the ARC. So give yourself just a little margin of error there. Once it gets submitted, it'll get assessed, and then you'll get an opportunity to write a response to the assessors in about mid-March, and then announcements will take place in the third quarter of 2021. So this is a long process before you'll find out the outcome. Okay, so the assessments move around from year to year. At the moment, they're set, so 50% of the score is based on the investigator and the capability, 25% is project quality and innovation, 15% is benefit, and 10% is feasibility. So because these are an individual award providing some funds for research, they are quite heavily skewed towards the investigator track record, but it does also have that capability bit. So 50% is the capacity of you to be able to undertake the research. And so there's a little bit of a blur between that investigator and the project quality and innovation, because it's not just you, it's your ability to undertake the project, which requires the project to be clean and well described. So in the investigator section, this is where you describe your research output and performance evidence, including record of high quality research outputs appropriate to the disciplines. And this is the ARC language. So high quality research outputs could be a range of things. So as a fundamental animal physiologist, it would be journal outputs for me. Depending on what your research is, it could be patents, it could be government reports. There are a range of research outputs that might be most appropriate for the disciplines. If we move out of STEM into HAS, things like artworks for fine arts and things like that come into play. So this is the assessment of the quality of your outputs as appropriate for the discipline. And it's also the capability of the candidate to build collaborations both within Australia and internationally. So again, there's that collaborative aspect within Australia and elsewhere. So that 50% of the score, a lot of it's going to be you, but some of it's going to be capacity building. Capability of you to develop collaborations that benefit Australia. Project quality and innovation is a quarter of the score. So you want your research to contribute to an important gap. So I'll come an example of performance evidence as opposed to research output. I'll come to that a little bit later when we talk about how to put one of these together. But a research output is a journal publication. Performance evidence is whether that research is impactful, highly cited, where it ranks, things like that. So part of it's just you did some stuff. The other is the impact that that stuff had. And I'll talk about how best, I'll give you some advice, I think, about how best to put yourself forward as strongly as you can with regard to those a little bit later on. So your research, contribute to an important gap in knowledge or a significant problem. Novelty, originality, and innovation of the proposed research. New methods, technologies, theories, or ideas that will be developed. A little note I'll add here is that just doing something new is not like using a new technique is not necessarily the stuff of innovation on its own. Applying an old technique in a new domain can be innovative. Developing a new technique for an old problem can be innovative. So it's about the combination, it's the innovation of the research, spanning the theory, the ideas that you're preparing or testing, the methods that you're applying to it. Not necessarily that you're using a new machine that was only just invented to address a hypothesis that was only proposed last week. That's not the only way that research can be innovative. The clarity of the hypotheses, theories, and research questions. We'll come a little bit later to talk about the challenge that the College of Experts face in assessing each of these and why clear writing is so important. The cohesiveness of the project design. You've basically got to be able to convince the assessors and the panel that you're able to do it and that you've thought everything through. And then again, the extent to which the research has the potential to enhance international collaboration. So that's coming up again and again. The benefit is you can sort of think of this as why should Australia pay for it? So the new or advanced knowledge resulting in outcomes of the research. So an important thing here is that the benefit doesn't have to be making a new widget or doobop that's going to improve the economy. New or advanced knowledge is considered a benefit of fundamental research, and the government recognises that, as does the ARC and the assessors and the College of Experts. Could be economic, commercial, environmental, or cultural benefits for Australia and international communities. And then again, we have the government's science and research priorities. So how is the research you're proposing to do aligning with what the government wants to achieve when they spend this $500 million or so? And then finally, feasibility. So the cost effectiveness of the research and its value for money. So what is the government getting when it pays for this? The feasibility, you want to be able to convince people that it can be done. This, I'll talk to this a little bit further later on, but this does present something of a challenge at Monash where the opportunity is greater. The scale at which we can work is greater than many other unis in the country, along with the other group of eights. The environment for the DECRA. So why is Monash the place to do this DECRA? Why is this the place that will support the research and provide the sort of intellectual supportive environment that will allow you to get the most out of it? And do you have the facilities that are necessary to complete the project? There's because we have so if we go back to the benefit, so somewhere through there will be whether the research addresses issues relating to Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders. And if that is the case, you will need to have strategies for collaborating with communities. So there's no way to get bonus points by saying you're going to do something that's relevant to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities without involving those communities. So what are the networks that enable you to engage with those communities? How are they going to be engaged if you're going to conduct research? I think this is an important one. It's that it's not about researchers claiming to be working in this space and getting bonus points for it. It's about meaningfully engaging with the communities. Okay. So when we start moving towards thinking about how you go about writing a DECRA, it's worth thinking about the assessment process, what all of the steps in that process are, because they give you information about what your audience is. And then as you prepare your work, you need to make sure that you engage with that audience appropriately. So you start with the application. So you'll assemble your application by the date in November and you'll submit it. The first thing that it happens is it goes to the assessment panel, which is comprised of members of the College of Experts. And then that panel will arrange for external assessment. So then it will go out to some specialist type readers they will produce an assessment. You will get to see that assessment in March. You'll have 2 weeks to write a rejoinder. You'll get a number of assessments, maybe 1, maybe 5, maybe more, usually 2 or 3. And then you'll have 5,000 characters in which to respond to, 5,000 characters including spaces, in which to respond to the assessments that you receive. After that, your application, your assessments, your rejoinder all go to the panel. The panel individually rank them, and then that ranking goes to a selection meeting, and then the panel have a fight about which ones get funded, or a healthy discussion, and then the outcomes are announced. So you've got 2 audiences you need to speak to here. You've got your external assessors and you've got your panel. You also need to think about what you present in terms of what external assessors the panel is going to choose, and then how those external assessors might review your grant. So part of the challenge in writing a grant is that you could have quite a diverse range of people to speak to. You may have to speak to the specialists in your field. You will almost certainly have to speak to non-specialists in your field. And then depending on exactly what your broad discipline is, will dictate how broad the selection panel is. So this needs to kind of be all things for all people. You need to be able to speak to a non-specialist, and you need to be able to speak to a specialist. And ideally, you want all of those people on your side arguing for the funding of your grant. Okay, so we've got 2 questions. Which one of these is the College of Experts, the panel or the external assessors? So the panel is drawn from the College of Experts. So the College of Experts is everyone, and then they pull together a panel to assess biological sciences, for example. And then, yes, everyone does get a chance at a rejoinder. So you will always see your assessments. You will always get a chance to write a rejoinder. Okay. So the applicants are assessed against the selection criteria in accordance with the weightings for that scheme. And they're generally seen by 2 types of assessors. At least 2 general assessors, which will be members of the panel, which will be drawn from the College of Experts, and at least 2 detailed assessors who are external assessors. And the ARC staff only assess eligibility. So the ARC staff have no role in deciding which grants get funded. The panel make a recommendation. The ARC convey that recommendation to the minister, and then the minister ultimately decides which grants are funded. It's not the college, it's not the panel, it's not the ARC who decide which grants are funded. They make recommendations. The minister decides which grants are funded. And it's always been like that. It's not a left-wing, right-wing government thing. It's the way that all governments do it in Australia. So the College of Experts have a really important role in overseeing the assessment process and in making that final set of recommendations. So the panel is drawn from the College of Experts for DECRAs. The panel choose the assessors. They choose the detailed assessors. The detailed assessors provide their reports. You provide a rejoinder. That all goes back to the panel. Then they make the final, as a group, make the final recommendation. So that College of Experts are really important because they dictate who your assessors are, your detailed assessors are, and they make the final recommendation. Okay. So it's important to think about who that College of Experts are. So the College of Experts are experts of international standing drawn from the Australian research community, from higher education, industry, and public sector research organisations. So the College of Experts is not representative of the people who get ARC grants. The college is representative of the community that ARC grants support. So most ARC grants go to the group of 8 universities, which includes Monash, but the panel is drawn from all universities in Australia, and they have varying research intensiveness. So these are not the total top of Australia's research achievers. These are representatives of Australia's research community. So there's a distinction there. There's an important subtlety. So the general assessors form that selection advisory committee, that panel. The selection advisory committee is drawn from the ARC College of Experts. You can go to the ARC website and see who is on the College of Experts. There are a number of people in Monash in the Faculty of Science who are on the College of Experts. There are a number more who have applied to be on the college for next year. And there are also other experts that are brought in as required. So they could be representatives from industry. So for the DECRA, it's probably going to be the Selection Advisory Committee. That panel is going to be convened mainly by Australian Research Council College of Experts members. For something like linkage grants or for ARC Centres of Excellence, you'll have more industry representation. So the first thing that the Selection Advisory Committee do is they assign detailed assessors. They then consider the application, the feedback from the assessors and the applicant's rejoinder, and then they assign a score for the application. Then all of the advisory committee members panel get together. They then get that sort of scored list that forms a ranked list, and then they have to decide what the final ranking is. And detailed assessors are not only from Australia. So you could get detailed assessors from other parts of the world. Australia will be overrepresented, but just as Australians review grants from all over the world, there are people from all over the world who review grants from Australia. So once the College of Experts members have scored the application, they go to the selection meeting, they review all of the submitted applications, and then they provide recommendations on which applications should be funded. So here we go. Detailed assessors are drawn from the Australian and the international research community, about a quarter of them from the international community. They provide in-depth assessments of the application by providing scores and comments against the selection criteria. So each of those selection criteria, when someone writes an ARC assessment, they have a little box in which they write a comment or a small paragraph explaining their score for that selection criteria. And then those assessments are then taken into consideration in the later stages of the peer review process in combination with your rejoinder. So could the detail reviewers be someone you have previously published with? There are rules for conflict of interest that would exclude people, but there are also time limits on those conflicts. So the short answer is probably not if it is recent, but yes, if it's longer term. And it's going to depend on the nature of that collaboration. So in fields where very large multi-author papers are the norm, you would potentially exclude an entire field if every co-author was excluded from assessment, but then every co-author is unlikely to be conflicted with every other of the 1,000 or so co-authors because they basically have no relationship with them. So there is a little bit of, what's the right word? Flexibility there. But if it's a close collaboration, typically you would be unlikely to get your close collaborators. So the assignment of assessors is quite important. And so part of what you do when you prepare your application is you try and get your application read by the most likely to be favourable assessors. So the system into which you submit your grant generates a sort of a word cloud, including your application summary, title, your impact statement, and your field of research and socioeconomic objective codes, which we'll come to. And then it uses that whole suite of information to identify people who have overlapping skills and experience. And then the computer generates a list of assessors. That information is then provided to the ARC executive directors and the College of Experts or Selection Advisory Committee members to inform which assessors are chosen. So they'll want to get a range of career stages, potentially a breadth of series of perspectives across different fields. They probably don't want the group of 8 applications just going to other group of 8 universities and vice versa. They want to get gender balance in there, and they want to get a range of assessor experience. They don't want applications to go to only very inexperienced or experienced. So that's where the judgment comes in the assessors trying to choose the right ones. And then the system also proposes a discipline panel, so biological sciences, chemistry, maths, engineering for the application, but those suggestions are also reviewed. So it depends on exactly which field you are as to how complicated that decision is. So biological sciences typically has its own panel, and so biological grants typically go there, for example. So you want your these bits of the application summary, title, impact statements, and those sets of codes to send it to the right assessors as best you can. You want it to be the audience who are going to be most receptive to your ideas. And then there's a scoring matrix. So under each of those criteria, the assessors will provide a score, a rating. That rating is from A to E, and it breaks up by percentages that should fall into those bands. So the top 10% go into A, the next 15 go into B, the next 20 into C, 35 into D, and 20 into E. So what's important here is this starts to give you an idea of the challenge, in that you can go all the way down to D, which is covering 80% of the applications. Yep, which is covering 80% of the applications before you get out of good. So it's only when you get to that bottom 20% where the applications are not considered good. If you think about what the success rates are, you need to be really in that outstanding and excellent set of categories. Now, typically part of the challenge that the ARC College of Experts face is that basically assessors like a lot of the research that they get asked to assess. And so A and B is reserved for the top 25% of applications, but the number of applications that are scored A and B is typically higher than 25%. So it's really hard to break the research out in this. And this is why these small margins become quite important. Margins around the clarity of presentation, how easy you make life for the College of Experts member, how clearly you've identified the innovative aspects, how well you've contextualized your research opportunity and performance. All of these bits come down to making a strong application, because you really need to be in those top couple of bands in order to be supported for funding. Do you get to know the score? So pretty much the game that gets played when assessments come out is usually guess the score you were given, because you never get to find out. What you do find out is, yes, it's every year. What you do find out is the experienced assessors will use this language. If you really like a grant as an assessor, and you've done this a few times, what you typically will do is, if you've scored everything in A and you think this is great research that you really want to get funded, you will use the word outstanding liberally throughout your assessment so that you can back up your score. But that's only the case if you tend to have experienced assessors who are familiar with the score, who are really familiar with the scoring matrix and really know that they want these things to match up. Other assessors might be scoring everything consistently in A, but they just won't use the word outstanding. They'll just say why it's great without using outstanding. So sometimes you can guess, sometimes you can't, and you never know. We have discussions every year about when discovery project assessments come out, when DECRA assessments come out, when future fellowship assessments come out. There's always a discussion about where people sit. And basically, all you really know when you get your assessments is that your grant was reviewed by someone. it's really hard to work out where it sits. You can probably guess that that person was carbon-based, but even then, that's probably too much. So you get your assessments, and then you get the opportunity to write a rejoinder. So 5,000 characters, including spaces. By some quirk of RMS, RMS always counts more spaces, more characters than Word does. So if you prepare something that's 4,999 characters in Word, it will be considered by RMS to be too long, which is always irritating. But it's your 5,000 characters to respond to the assessment. So it's where you get to address any queries they raised, you get to clarify details. It can be a really good opportunity to point out where reviewers or assessors, sorry, have made a mistake, particularly if they say things like, the applicant never explained what machine they'll be measuring this on, but you explained it on page 14. You just say, this is explained on page 14. So you can use language like that to undermine the assessors if you think they're doing a hatchet job on your work. And the detailed assessors never get to see your rejoinder. So they will never read the things that you say. So the idea there is to be candid, clear, and you have to be concise because you've only got 5,000 characters. The ARC takes the peer review process seriously. It respects it. It doesn't intervene in it. They don't want public servants getting involved in the process wherever possible. But interventions are possible. So we have an example within the faculty of a DECRA, I'm going to say 3 years ago now, maybe 4, where the assessor, the detailed assessor, very clearly did an extremely personal hatchet job. But it was obviously about the way that person felt about Monash, not how they felt about the research or the researcher that was being proposed in DECRA. It was just they were aggrieved by Monash for some reason, and they used this as an opportunity to let the ARC know. That person's DECRA was funded, and so I think through the intervention process, that assessment was removed by the ARC because it was very clearly biased. So you do have a very small window after the assessments come out, bearing in mind you've got 2 whole weeks, you've got only 2 weeks for the rejoinder. You have a much shorter period in which to get a biased review or an inappropriate review thrown out. So you need to act very quickly on that. But by and large, you're stuck with the assessments you get unless there's a really obvious case of bias. So we're still in the assessment process. So the detailed assessments are reviewed by the general assessors on the panel, the advisory committee, the College of Experts members. They finalise their scores by conferring with each other, and I'll talk with you a little bit about the time that they have to make those decisions, which is important, again, for how you go about preparing your application. They get their final scores in, they rank, and then those all come together within a panel meeting, and then the decisions are made. So before that panel meeting, they get to see each other's rankings. They can review applications which they don't have a conflict of interest with. They get to note any issues. They can think of those which they want to discuss. And then the particular attention is paid. So if you've got a ranking, and then you've got those that are likely to be funded at the top, then you've got a big grey area, which is around the line, some of which will be funded and some of which won't. Those are the ones that are drawn in for special consideration, just to make sure that they don't make any mistakes in that zone. So around the likely funding cutoff are those that get the most discussion. So one of the things that has come up in recent years is this national interest test. This is the test which there was a fear that this was the way for the minister to only fund the things that they thought were important. But it really hasn't actually changed the way the ARC works. The ARC is always, or the minister is always making decisions on grants that are in the what they view to be in the national interest. It's their job to make those decisions. So the national interest test is defined as the extent to which research contributes to Australia's national interest through its potential to have economic, commercial, environmental, social, or cultural benefits to the Australian community. So that sort of social, cultural, commercial, environmental, that covers a lot of what the fundamental research that we do in a faculty like the Faculty of Science. So we fall within that national interest test, but it's just another piece of text that the minister has access to in order to make their decisions. So if your research doesn't satisfy the national interest test, it won't be recommended for funding. If it doesn't, even if it is recommended, if it's not close, if it's not clearly within the national interest, the minister is unlikely to fund it. If it is to help develop more efficient bomb-making methods for deployment in a country that Australia doesn't get along with, it's unlikely to be in the national interest. And I'm not aware that any STEM grants have ever been denied on the basis of the national interest test, but some grants in HAS faculties, humanities, arts and social sciences have. Okay, so I had a little sip of water. So we now come to thinking about the challenge that you face. So these are success rates for male and female applicants through to the DE20, so one round ago. And they hover basically around 15%. So the chance is always across the country. It's a very difficult scheme. It's better than in a lot of other countries in terms of the equivalent schemes, but it's still challenging. A good piece of news for those of you here is that Monash often bats above the national average. So we tend to hover around the 20s, mid-20s. And there's also no difference in success rates for Monash applicants who did their PhD at Monash or are doing a postdoc at Monash and then apply for a DECRA to stay at Monash. So the success rates are unchanged relative to whether or not you are already at Monash. So it's often a concern that people who need to move, or sorry, people who are unable to move for family or other reasons will be disadvantaged. The data suggests that is not the case. So the success rates hover, we tend to do better than the national average. There's also some gossip that you'll hear, which is that most of the grants go to people who are 5 years out of PhD or late out of PhD, and no one gets them straight out of PhD. In one respect, that's kind of true, but it's basically just because most people don't apply until they're 4 or 5 years out of PhD. Whereas if we look at the success rates, and these are the national success rates, it's pretty much the same for every year since PhD. So the timing should not be dictated by waiting until you're a certain number of years out of PhD. There are better ways to decide when the appropriate time that you should consider applying is. So you will probably, even after I've said this, you'll get people who don't believe it, but you can go and look at the selection outcome statistics and verify it for yourself if you like. There's no difference in success rates really across those different times since PhD. So this is, I think, an important point. When you're trying to decide when to apply, it is almost always a mistake to try and game it based on what you think the stats say is your optimal time. So more people get them 5 years out of PhD, but more people also apply. So don't use that as evidence to think, oh, I should leave it till years 4 and 5. You should apply when the appropriate time is for you. That might be dictated by opportunities. You know, this point in time is a difficult time to be a research scientist because mobility is challenged. Victorians aren't welcome anywhere in Australia at the moment. And so mobility is reduced. Maybe getting opportunities overseas is more challenging because it's unclear when you're going to be able to travel. And so if now is an appropriate time for your personal circumstance, given travel and family and other obligations, now is the time to apply. The only thing that really matters in terms of when you might optimize is when you're best positioned to put in a killer application. So when your research is at a point, that's the best time to have a crack, when it suits Monash, when your CV is in the right place. So you know, if your CV is stunning coming out of a PhD, but you don't have, like, you've published your entire PhD and waiting a year is not going to lead to more outputs. There's no harm in going, no disadvantage in going straight after. There might actually be an advantage because that could be where your optimum performance relative to opportunity sits. When you do come to apply, you want to be able to answer these questions. This is an individual focused grant. 50% is basically on your track record or thereabouts your track record. And so it's, why are you the person that Australia should fund? Why should they fund you to do research at Monash? Why should they fund you now, not 2 years from now? And why should Australia pay for it? So those are the questions that you really want to come across in your application. And so when you assemble it, you've got these different components. Now, a challenge in putting it together is that these components don't map perfectly to the selection criteria. So if you look there under the project description includes investigator and project quality and innovation. So that's 2 different selection criteria. You've got a whole section, part F, for participant details and rope, which is in that investigator capability section as well. So your investigator capability is spread across 2 different components. Your feasibility might be dictated by project cost. Your benefit might be influenced by project cost. Your eligibility is going to be dictated by medical research policy and the timeline during which your PhD was awarded, and career interruptions. So these bits are spread across multiple elements. So you don't get to just write one section which is on your investigator, one section which is on project quality and innovation. It's sort of spread across multiple bits, which means you are going to be coming to the same issues multiple times as you work through your application. So you have the part A, the administrative summary. This includes the title, who you are, your application summary, your objectives and your national interest test. So you can sort of think of loosely, part A might be the bit that the minister cares about. And the minister has to decide if this recommended grant is going to be funded. They're unlikely to go and read the project description in which you explain your methods. They might read that first bit to see if it aligns with something that they think the government should be spending money on. You'll come down to your project description, and that's where you have your title, of course, but then you have your first section that you come to is the bit about you. Why are you the person who should be doing this research? That's kind of challenging to answer without leading out a little bit of information about what the research is. So in order to say why you're the person doing the research, you might have a little bit about the real high level, broad aspects of the project. Then you go into why your project is innovative. And at this point, you're starting to get into the bits that the detailed assessors, who might read everything, they're likely to be reading all of this. Your College of Experts member probably sits somewhere between the minister, who might just read the administrative summary, or the minister's lackey who reads that, I'm not sure. Then it could be the College of Experts member read the administrative summary, the high level information, they'll read your ropes, they'll read your project description, but they're reading a lot of grants, and so they might not retain all of that information. Your detailed assessor is hopefully going through it with a fine-tooth comb. Okay, so that was supposed to be the 30-minute section, but it took an hour. The next bit is going to be about preparing the application and getting all the right bits in it. But before that, does anyone have any questions about what I've said so far that they haven't already popped into chat? It's a really good question. So what is the difference between D1 capability and rope? So the rope section has some specific components to it, where you describe what's the, for example, what the publication or the publishing norms are for your field, what your career trajectory has been, what your the different things that you've done through your career are. Whereas the investigator capability in Part D might be a little bit more weighted towards the previous research and how that relates to the research that you're proposing. So it might be more along the lines of rope is about the outputs. Part D, the investigator capability section, is more about the research that you've done. So what science you've done as opposed to what papers you've written, for example. That little breakdown there, but they do overlap. So you will have bits of information that are repeated across there, and there's just no way to avoid that. And it is one of the harder parts about writing, particularly an ARC fellowship application, is the redundancy across sections. It's quite hard to sort of, we tend not to try and repeat information, but the way that these applications are assembled and the bits that they expect us to talk about mean that we inevitably do repeat some information, and that's just a bit annoying. In project quality and innovation, how much of preliminary results can we show? There's no requirement for preliminary results. There's no limit on how much you can show. So kind of whatever you need to get the story done. Like preliminary information is going to speak to feasibility, but it's not like what you might have heard about for something like an NSF grant in the US, where you pretty much have to have done the research in order to get the funding to do it. There is no requirement for preliminary data. There's no real or implied requirement for preliminary data in an ARC application. And through my own career, I've done both. I've used preliminary data, and particularly earlier in my career, I never used preliminary data. I use it now mostly because I have it. It's always a tricky line, right? If we include preliminary data, will the reviewer think that the project is almost done? So I tend to use, when I use preliminary data, I tend to use it to take the reader on a journey to what needs to be done still. So I wouldn't use preliminary data typically that I'm then going to go and collect. I would use preliminary data that justifies why the much bigger, much more exciting experiment I'm proposing needs to be done. But it is a little bit of a risk. So as an example, I've done 2 linkage infrastructure equipment and facilities grants in the last couple of years. The first time we used a lot of preliminary data to show that we had capacity, and one of the assessors wondered why we even bothered submitting a grant, given that we've clearly already done everything we're seeking to do. That was not the case, but it just meant that I'd written it badly. I hadn't conveyed what we were planning to do beyond the preliminary data I'd put forward. So I fixed that this year. So there is a tricky little line there, but it's particularly valuable. So for me, I'm a biologist. I often collect data from the literature. So I might use a new compilation of data from the literature to suggest there's something interesting in the experiments that I'll propose as part of the grant application. And that keeps them clearly distinct. This preliminary data is just the background from the literature. I'm going to go get new data using experiments and doing science. So that's how I separate that out. Okay. So we will now talk about writing a DECRA. So this first bit is really about getting you in the head of a College of Experts member and giving you an understanding of the scope of the job that they have to do, and then why it's important to write the way that you need to. And then we'll go through some of the other elements, and we'll likely have more chances for questions afterwards. Okay, so this is a College of Experts perspective. So this was written by Moira O'Brien, who's the head of biological sciences and a member of the College of Experts. So I told you what the ARC say for how the process works. This is how Moira experienced the process from the other side. In previous years, I've asked Moira to come to these sessions. Obviously, it's a bit more difficult now, and it worked really well the time when she came, because she came in and she was basically Hurricane Moira and explained all of the things that she had to do as part of the DECRA process, and then had to leave and go to another meeting. It was a perfect example of the life of a College of Experts member. So Moira had 45 applications. So these were for discovery projects. She had 45 applications as the primary carriage member for a discovery project. She had 40 as secondary carriage, and she had 20 DECRAs. So That's 105 applications, each of which is definitely no less than 50 pages. So you can do the maths on how many pages of text that is in order to get her head around. And those primary carriage ones are the ones that she needs to speak to in the meeting. So there are 45 at least applications that she needs to be across in order to present them to her, to the other members of the panel. So the words in their grants or their publications or words they've added in themselves are used to assign, or the words that the ARC have added in are used to assign applications to college members. So Moira's example was that she's done, she's a reproductive biologist, so she's got work on sperm. So apparently that made her an expert in fluid mechanics based on one paper that she was a mid-author on. So she got fluid mechanics papers originally assigned to her. So this is a biologist who works in male infertility being assigned fluid mechanics. So it gives you an idea of how far away from your field the college members could potentially be. The ranking, half of it is based on the College of Experts. So half of it is based on that panel, and the other half is based on the external assessors. And she said here that those grants had 2 to 7 external assessments in the year that she saw them. So the importance of the detailed and the panel members is pretty balanced in terms of how much they contribute to the final outcome. So you really do need to speak to both audiences. And the ARC sets the funding or assessment range and the rank. So you have that ranked list based on the College of Experts members' adjusted scores, which they take to the panel meeting. And then the ARC will say, we're able to fund 70% of the requested budget for discovery projects, 91% of the budget for DECRAs. This was in 2018. That will mean that there's a line drawn on that ranked list where these ones get funded, the ones above it, the line get funded, the ones below don't. And so then the College of Experts members can go back and look at those ones that are below the line that they think are for discussion. So they'll see that these ones are not expected to be funded. And then the College of Experts members will have to go back, look at that list and decide which ones they want to discuss, which is basically the ones that they want to see if they should be funded. They want to have a second look at them with the whole panel present. So this is another really important window into the importance of the College of Experts members, because if your grant is scored below that line, it's the College of Experts member flagging it, which could bring it back up. So they need to know why your grant's important, why Australia should care, why it matters, who you are, and they need to remember that, and then they need to be able to take that to the panel and move you back above the line. So if the grants fall below the line and no college member thinks we need to discuss them, that is game over. So that is where it's really important for the detailed assessors. You want the detailed assessors to lift you above the line as well. So you have to speak to both groups. So then there's the grant discussion. So they've worked out which ones they've put in for discussion, the ones that are above the line plus those that were flagged. And then the primary carriage member gives a brief discussion of the grant, a brief sort of presentation on the grant, and then recommends further discussion or not. So remember, Moira for the discovery projects had 45 as primary carriage. So of those that were flagged for discussion, she needed to be able to provide a 1-minute-ish presentation to a panel about why that grant should be funded. And she had 45 of them potentially to do, 20 odd DECRAs, something like that. So you've got to have that message clear. You've got to give the college, you've got to give it to them a clear recollection of your grant. You've got to give them a clear message of what you want to achieve and a clear message of who you are and why you matter to get funded, both so that they remember you and think it's great and they want it above the line, but also so that they can use that to convince the panel to fund you. So that's really important. If it comes down to discussion, the primary carriage has a minute, maybe 2, to talk about the importance of CV, feasibility and all of that. The second carriage, so for Moira, that was another 40 odd grants, may add a bit more information, and then they recommend funding or not. They'll discuss comments and the rejoinder, Other panel members may chip in, but remember that each of the panel members has their own 45 grants to think about. But if you've got a really clear, important message and one of the other panel members in going through their pile have found your grant and thought, this seems cool, then when it comes to that discussion, they may go in. They may throw into the pool of discussion, and then that may move you across the line. Then they vote. And just because the assessors have given you good scores, which has led to high ranks, doesn't mean that the grant's going to get funded. So you may have gotten, for example, assessors that each only reviewed one grant each. They gave you all A's across the board, but then the panel don't necessarily agree with that because they've read 40 or 100 or 150 grants. So the College of Experts are required to hit that pay line. So for DECRA is 91%, so they can't fund everything in every budget, which means you need to be able to justify not what something costs, but why you need it. And the college members really hate gouging. So if you're obviously padding your budget with things that aren't necessary just so they can be taken away, it pisses them off. And you don't want the college members irritated. But you can give them useful things to cut. So PhD scholarships, publication costs, travel costs could be things that would be really, really good for the research are well justified. But they could also be dropped out without making the college feel like the grant is no longer feasible if you cut them out. And this is just Moira's take on who sits on, in her case, it was the biological sciences panel. So she refers to them as good people who have a boatload of work to do, and they're representative of the Australian university sector, not people who get grants. So she talks quite a bit about the passive half point, which is really just about making things clear, easy to find, well presented, just so that the panel members are on your side. And think about what the job is reading through that pile of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages from 100 or so grants. How difficult it is if you're wading through treacle to try and find the little gem in a grant, as opposed to something that's nice and clear that you can just get it. And it's a well-balanced panel in terms of the representation across the full Australian sector, including regional universities. And so things that are possible at Monash are not necessarily possible at other places. And so you've got to be mindful of that your audience is not someone who has the platforms that we have, who have the synchrotron next door, who have opportunities that are available at Monash but might not be available at another university in Australia that doesn't have that research intensiveness than we do. So you want to be able to speak to all of those people and explain why Monash works for you. And then she also makes a note about interdisciplinary grants. So this is interdisciplinary, not looking at two subdisciplines within chemistry or within biology or within maths. This is crossing discipline boundaries to the extent that there might be two panels. So if you write a grant that sits very obviously in biology and engineering, the risk there is that your grant will have to be assessed by both the biology panel and the engineering panel, and then you need both panels to decide it has to get funded before it will be funded. So if you do have a grant like that, interdisciplinarity is great, but you want to make it structured in such a way that it either goes to the engineering panel only or to the biology panel only. So it's a biology grant that includes some engineering, it's an engineering grant that includes some biology. It's not a grant that the ARC will look at and decide it has to send it to both panels, because that is a challenging line to walk. So there's a tip sheet that Moira prepared, which we will distribute. So her tips for getting a good project score is to think about the reviewers, both the detailed assessors and the college member. Make sure it's understandable by someone smart from a discipline that's not yours. This is part of the reason we do this front page readership thing, which happens on Friday. And I see that's full, so we might have to do another one. The This is a chance for me to try and read it, and I read across many disciplines, so I can also pretend not to be a biologist. You want your grant to be clear to be why your grant is important and relevant, and you want your grant to be interesting. You want it to be something you're excited about, because that excitement it's easier to convey. It's easier to make a piece of writing come across as interesting if you're excited about it. So this is where giving yourself some time can be important. If you are bashing this out in the last 2 weeks, desperately tired and stretched in all other ways, it's really hard to get that excitement through. And you want them to care. So you want them to, the science, the maths to be amazing. You want to make it clear why this is going to make the world a better place. That's not necessarily curing cancer or building a better solar panel or doing something with COVID. This is, these are people who are assessing it, are people from the Australian university sector and the international university sector. They understand the value of fundamental science. They want to know from your grant why this is going to advance knowledge. And you want to make it clear why Australia should pay, which is Australia's going to be doing something important or impressive that's going to be increasing Australia's reputation beyond, well, it's going to be increasing the reputation of Australia in science. She also provided some advice about the research output section. Oh, and I didn't say at the beginning, we'll also distribute these slides, and it's being recorded, so you'll get this, no need to write all this down. So follow the formatting instructions. It seems obvious, but she makes a key point here, which is that if you don't follow the formatting instructions, it makes it look like you're an outsider. So among fundamental research, the ARC, well, people who are typically funded by the ARC don't like it when medical researchers come and get ARC money. People who are funded by the NH and MRC don't like it when ARC funded researchers come and get their money. So if you have a grant that is submitted to the ARC, but structured like an NHMRC grant, that just is going to irritate reviewers. Use a sans serif font as it's easier to read on the computer screen. List author titles in full. I almost always do this personally. It might not help the detailed assessors who know the field. It will help the non-specialist college members who don't know the field to understand what these papers you're citing are about. Give them data when you can, so impact factors and citations. Number of publications so that people don't have to count them. That's less relevant now because the way that the CV is formatted has changed. And then this last little bit is about numbers of publications, which is more relevant to later career stages. So she ends with this red box. So this is her formatting, not mine. She ends with this red box of short, non-repetitive sentences are good. Make it easy. So think of the college members reading hundreds of grants in a short space of time, doing their day jobs, looking after their families. Make it as easy as you can. Make them enjoy reading your grant so that it's one of the ones they fight for. So the front page will be capability. So I've got a question in the chat. The front page will be capability. So do you need to talk about the project in this section? I think you would to an extent. You don't want to go into detail, but given that it's capability, you want to contextualize yourself in terms of what you're able to achieve for the project you've proposed. So I would have only like real high level stuff in that first page of your project description in terms of what the project is about. Because saying that you're a neurosurgeon doesn't help me understand why you have capability for the project if I don't know what the project is about. Yes, make sure you have a Google Scholar page and you keep it up to date. For early career researchers, I would recommend that this is critical beyond the grant. Have a Google Scholar page. If someone approaches me about a potential job or wants to write a grant, it's the first place I go looking for them, just because it means I can see everything that they've done. I can see it updated, more updated than their website's likely to be. Google's really good at catching references, so keep that up to date. If a college member, or probably less an assessor, but if a college member has got someone that they think has promise, but they want to know what they've been up to, they can go and see if this work that they talked about as unpublished has appeared in the last 6 months since they've submitted the grant. So keep your Google Scholar page and curate it so that it's accurate. Okay. So one of the things that you'll need to assemble, and this will need to happen relatively early because you have an earlier deadline on this, is a statement by the administering organisation. So the statement from the administering organisation is a document that's nominally written by Rebecca Brown, who's the Senior Vice Provost and the Vice Provost for Research. So she signs a administering organisation statement for every DECRA applicant that comes through the university. In reality, Rebecca's not sitting there writing statements for every grant application that goes through Monash because there's too many and she has other things to do. So this starts with you. So if you're interested in writing a DECRA, you want to start with your potential host, preparing a strategic statement, preparing a statement by the administering organisation. You can get access to previous ones. The research director from the school can help you out. And basically what this does, it just contextualizes who you are, why the university cares. They say good things about you. They summarize why, at a high level, they summarize why your research is important and why you matter for the organization that's going to be hosting you. So it's worthwhile getting this ball rolling because you'll need to write it. Your research director and head of school will need to approve it. I then need to approve all of the ones that come through the Faculty of Science, and then Rebecca needs to approve all of the ones that come through the university. So that all takes time. And there's typically a little bit of iteration. So I think I'll talk about that next, yeah. So when you're putting it together, you can get a copy of a statement from someone else from the school. You fill in the bits that are about you to make sure that it reads as if it is a personalised statement. So you start with a template, information from your school, fill in the rest from you. But remember when you're writing this, when you're putting it together, remember it's written by Rebecca Brown. Now Rebecca's actually very interdisciplinary. She has engineering degree and a HAS degree. So I think social science and something in water and engineering across masters and PhD. But she's not going to understand the nuts and bolts of your research project. She's not going to understand particular bits of data collection. Okay, yeah, so when you do prepare it, you want it to be high level. You want it to be that someone who understands broadly what research across the entire university looks like would say, because this is not you writing it, this is Rebecca Brown writing it. You're just giving her the detailed draft. So there's only a template on DE21 on MRO that will be updated. So I think probably what will happen is MRO, I don't think we have the instructions to applicants for the coming round. And so it's the instructions to applicants from the ARC that provide the detailed information about what we do. And that's, once that instructions to applicants is available, MRO will be able to update their templates, but it probably is not going to change much. How early this has to be, I put that in an earlier slide. I can't remember the date off the top of my head now, rather than flick back through 40 odd slides. So it's in this slide deck. It's also, there we go. Thanks, Anna. So instructions to applicants are due to come out by September 16. And then it'll be, I can't remember the exact date when the strategic statement needs to be to MRO, but the Faculty Research Office are going to distribute some information about that to this list. So it's a few weeks. So the faculty will need it in a few weeks of when the MRO need it. And I think the MRO date is on the MRO website currently. So the approval process, there we go. Thanks, Jasmine. November 11, so that's the MRO date, so 2 weeks prior to that. Cool. Thanks, Anna. It's a team effort, this. So the approval process, The school will need time to do it. The deadline for it to come to faculty is 2 weeks before the MRO, because I need time to read them all and provide feedback, and then you need time to make the changes and send it back. And then it goes from faculty to MRO. MRO might not make you revise it, but they also might. So it's all time. It's got to go across the desks of a bunch of busy people. And the earlier that it comes in, the more detailed feedback you're likely to get. If it comes in, you know, kind of right on the deadline or a tiny bit after, it's unlikely that we would just say no when you're not allowed to submit, but it does mean that the quality of review you're going to get will be diminished. And we're often talking about small margins here. Like, everyone on this call is doing cool stuff. Everyone who's applying is doing cool stuff. And so the small margins matter. So if you can give us time, we can do the best that we can to help. Okay, I need to briefly just let my cat out. Please hold. I'm sure he'll be wanting to come back in a few minutes. Okay, so now it's about the project. So you understand the problem that the College of Experts face. Now you want to assemble a project that's going to excite the detailed assessors, that's going to excite the college, and that the minister is going to say, cool, and sign. So it needs to be something that you can do. So you need to have some track record on the topic. This is not necessarily track record on the exact thing you're going to do. This is track record that positions you to be the person to do what you're planning to do. So you could bring related expertise to a topic that makes your track record the person, that your track record positions you as the perfect person to innovate in this area that you're moving into. That might be a case where a little bit of pilot data could help, a little bit of literature scanning or something like that. But it needs to be something where you can make a difference and that your background positions you to make that difference. It needs to be something important. So you need to convince those college members that the project is necessary. It needs to have benefits to Australia. This can include training opportunities for students. You could host workshops depending on what your field is. You could collaborate internationally. You could bring benefit to Australia by engaging with the leading people in your field to have them contribute to your research and thereby grow Australia's research capacity. Something you can do, like something you are able to do. So a good proof of concept potentially can help. And this is where we get to, I think it was Brian's question. Yes, it was. Something that's not already completed, but maybe a bit of proof of concept that enables you to show that you can possibly do it. So that's that fine line to work. And then something you can do well at Monash. So, you know, I like Monash. I've not spent my whole career here and I'm happy here, but you know, think about whether Monash is the best place for you to do this research. If it is, Monash is the place to do it. If there is somewhere else that is more appropriate, you want to give some thought to that. There, as we've said, there are many good reasons why people might be constrained in their ability to move, but if there is somewhere better to do this research and that place is Deakin Burwood, which is just up the road, the question might reasonably be asked, why are you doing it at Monash? So you want to be able to think about that part of that question being, why Monash? Why is this the place for this research to make the biggest contribution? And don't expect the assessors or college members to know why that is. You're going to need to tell them. So the question here in regards to that, if we got our paper published relative to the project during its review stage, will it affect the review outcome? No. So you are not supposed to, in the rejoinder phase, you are not supposed to bring new data to the discussion. So that could be new data with regard to track record. It could be new data with regard to pilot studies. The rejoinder is about clarifying aspects of the application as raised by the assessors. So that works in both ways. You know, if you've submitted a grant that you're very excited about, you click the button and then you immediately start doing the research. That doesn't matter for the outcome of the grant. But by the flip side, if you have a great idea, you submit the project, and then you submit your paper to science, and then it gets accepted, that also doesn't help you at the rejoinder stage, because it's about an equitable assessment of everyone's track record and project relative to opportunity at the time the applications close. So with regard to project description, I have some advice from another College of Experts member. So this was Kate Smith-Miles, who provided advice to maths in 2017. So this is her advice regarding the project descriptions. So having a strong track record and assessors who love it helps. That is not at all surprising, but the key sentence I think here is this second one. So it's even better if the college member really understands why this is important. Remembering that the college members are not necessarily experts in the field. In fact, they're probably not experts in the field. So if the college member doesn't understand why the project is important, then they can't follow it. They can't make that case in 1 or 2 minutes to the rest of the panel as to why the project should be funded. If it's just an application which is like, hey, here's some words about some science I'm going to do, and I've got a great track record, it'll be fine. That's not something that the college members can easily convey to the panel. So you really want that importance of the research to come through loud and clear. So you want to give them the tools to make a 2-minute pitch. So a 2-minute pitch that the College of Experts member can understand, one that they can find, one that they're convinced by, and one that they can use to convince a room full of other non-experts that this work should be funded. And so this is why, historically, we put a lot of emphasis on the first page of the project description. Now, the first page of the project description used to be project quality and innovation. And when we talk about project quality and innovation, we'd also try and weave in a little bit of track record so that someone could flick through the project description when they're on the panel meeting, scan that page and have the information that they need. That's now changed, so it's now investigator capability, and then you go into the project description. But a lot of that still kind of stands. If you can use that investigator section to give that real sort of high-level understanding for the college member or for the panel member, why the research is important and why you're the person to do it. So remember, you're supposed to be talking about yourself, but you can talk about the research as it relates to your track record. So you can get, remember, they're only looking for a 2-minute pitch, just a couple of sentences. So this is why we still emphasize that first page, because it puts it somewhere where they can find. And it's also really important for the detailed assessors, because I'm not a college member, but I review grants. And when you're going through and reading these long documents, you either get on board fast or you get off board fast. It's relatively rare that you're sitting on the fence after you've read a few paragraphs. So you want that beginning of the first page to draw you in. It's like, this person seems great, and this thing that they're planning to work on, what they've said about it makes me want to keep reading. I'm excited enough to find out the rest. So that's why, again, we're still focusing on that first page, because it's that real first impression that a reader will get. So what hurts a proposal is that it's too hard for the assessor to understand what it's all about. If they're on page 4 of 10 or 8 or whatever it is, before they really understand what the project's about, they're probably also bored. So that can hurt with the detailed assessor, but it can also hurt with the College of Experts member, because if they're trying to find, it's like, I remember this person was going to do something that was, can't find it. And they're frantically flicking through pages. Their enthusiasm for the project is just going to be slipping away as they're frantically trying to say, what was that cool sentence? I need to be able to tell the college members that. So think about it as you're trying to get people on your side, and you're trying to give them the tools to convince other people to get on your side as well. So some tips to improve the chances. So get the first page of some previous applications. There are lots of previous DECRA applicants who are willing to share. The Faculty of Science Research Office can help facilitate that. And give your pitch to people. Give them the opening couple of paragraphs, the opening page and a half. So the first page is kind of, it's not one side of A4, it's that first bit. Give them that opening bit, let them read it and see if they can tell you what you do and what the project's about. If they can't, your pitch isn't quite right. So use each other. You've got a community of people here who are on this, this call. Get in touch with them if you know them. It'll give you someone to complain with, which is also useful when you're trying to write these things, but also just someone who can read it and tell you if it's coming across the way that you hope it is. So these are the 4 questions about how to write the pitch. So we're getting a bit more into the project quality and innovation now. It's just 25% of the skill. So what's known, what's unknown, why is there a need, and how does this proposal fill this need? So for me, when you're writing this bit, I really think of it as the ones that I'm most excited by is as I'm going through this what's known, what's unknown phase, I'm starting to think, you know what someone really needs to do? Someone should do an experiment to solve this. And then I get to the experiment and then I'm excited. It's like, oh, look, someone should definitely do that. So you want to take the reader on a journey, use what's known, pull out what's unknown so that they're starting to already, they're making up their own mind about what needs to happen in the field. And then if you've led them to the right place, by the time you're telling them what you're going to do, they've already decided that's what someone needs to do because you've set up this tension about what we need to understand. And then when you say, I'm going to do it, they're like, great, I was really hoping someone would do that. Give everything an A, fund this project. So it's this sort of storytelling aspect to it, taking them on a journey with you so that they're then on your side and they want you to finish the story for them by going and doing the science. I appreciate it all sounds a little bit trite, but when you read lots of these things, you really do get that, when you've got that enthusiasm, when you've got that clear understanding of what the problem is, that it needs to be solved, you'd be convinced it needs to be solved, and then you're then convinced that this is the project that's going to solve it. Even if it's not, curing cancer, curing COVID, whatever, if it's this bit of research you've been convinced needs to be solved, it's really hard to go past those projects. They really bring you on board. And this bit can also help with your investigator capability bit, because say I'm in a situation where I'm reviewing the grants, the investigator capability, I'm thinking, maybe this one's about a B. These people are great, but maybe they're just not quite in that top 10%. And then you go through the project quality and innovation, you're being led down this journey about what needs to be solved. And you've been convinced that this is a problem that can be solved by this project and this person. You can then go back and revisit your track record and think, actually, no, this person's perfect for this project. And I really want to know the answer. So now everything's an A. So these things also interleave in that if you can get someone along with you wanting to see this science done, convinced that you're the person to do it, it's more easy to convince them that your track record is the track record that's needed to solve this problem. So this is the project description bits. So this is the last instructions to applicants. So you're looking at 10 pages, including references. Must be in the specific format. Do not go away from the format. They require you to put the headings in this format. They require the headings to be in this order. You can't deviate from that or else you breach eligibility. I don't know that anyone's been kicked out for fonts, but they probably have been, or kicked out for orders, but they probably have been across the country. You're not allowed to put text between the project title and the investigator capability heading. So this is an example of how specific these instructions are. They want everything to be in the same format so it can be compared equitably. But also, they don't want you sneaking your project in between the title and the capability. So you've got to follow the format. So when you write to your investigator capability section, you want to be talking about why you are the person to do this research. And in order to do that, you do need to say a little bit probably about what the research is. So you want to give the record of high quality research outputs and the capability of the candidate to build collaborations within Australia and internationally. But also remember that your research outputs and performance evidence appears in section F. So there'll be a list of publications there. So this is not the place to list all of your publications. This is the place to talk about the contribution that your research has made with citations. So it's a subtle difference there. Project quality and innovation. You want to contribute to an important gap of knowledge or a significant problem. So you need to have identified that gap. The novelty and originality in the proposed research. I talked a little bit earlier about how that's not necessarily just that this technique has been invented. It could be that you're bringing this old technique to this new field where it's never been applied, and you might be the person to bring that technique. And it could be that makes your background appropriate for the project. Clarity of hypotheses, theories, and research questions. Make everything clear, polished. Finish writing early so that you can put it in a desk for 2 weeks and go back and read it. So Timothy, does capability or collaborations mean outline the collaborations you plan or highlight the potential based on past collaborations? I would say it's a little bit of both. So draw on past collaborations or your experience building them where you can. If you are doing this project at Monash because you've got access to this expertise and this infrastructure, and you're also bringing in a new international collaborator, that's great as well. So a little of both there. Cohesiveness of the project design and implementation plan. This is a problem that I have had in my own grants over the last couple of years. It's gotten a bit broad and flowery, doesn't come across as cohesive. It's not convincing the panel that I'd be able to do it. So you've got to make sure that your plan is cohesive. And this is where getting outside readers can be very important because they'll see gaps that you won't. And then the international collaboration thing. So benefit. So benefit includes new or advanced knowledge resulting from the outcomes of the research. So benefit is not increasing Australia's GDP by 0.5%, although if you are doing that, cool. Benefit is new or advanced knowledge. So that's a lot of the work that we do in the faculty here is about that. Economic, commercial, environmental, social, cultural benefits, and Australian government's national science and research priorities. So do go and look those up. Do go and see what they are, and do point out when your research aligns with them. So what you're trying to say in the benefit section is, why should Australia care? How will it make a difference to Australia, to Australia's international reputation? Why should Australia pay for it? And then feasibility is the sort of your opportunity to convince the panel and the assessors that the research can be done. Okay. You also have a few other sections, your communications of results. So communication of results is a good one to get from previous applications or from your host, because so if you are well embedded in the faculty, you might know who the appropriate people to contact in your school or faculty are for facilitating communications. If you're not, it's very useful to just get those from somewhere else. Your references are the only things that are allowed to be in 10-point font. I would again try and include the titles if you can. I like including the titles because it allows the non-specialist to understand what the research I'm citing is about, at least in a broad sense. I also like the application not to be too dense. So if I've got space to devote a page to references, including titles, I find that helps me feel like it's not just a big wall of text that's going to be too hard for them to digest and remember. And then there's the opportunity for an acknowledgement section here. I don't know quite the extent to which this will have an impact in DECRA, but I have seen detailed assessors say positive things about the use of an acknowledgement section in a discovery project application. And so you might use the acknowledgement section to your advantage, potentially. So if you, during your PhD, supervised an honours student, and that honours student collected data that's not yet published, but that data is being used as pilot data for your DECRA application, you can acknowledge that honours student in the acknowledgements, and you're giving that student the due recognition for the work that they've done, but you're also showing the readers that you can supervise a student to a successful outcome and to collect good data. So you're also helping yourself there. Is there any guidance as to how, so question, is there any guidance as to how much you should write for each section? The general rule of thumb is that you should devote as much space as the selection criteria break down. So 50% is investigator capability, 25% is project quality and innovation. But bear in mind, investigator capability falls over multiple sections. There's part of it in D, there's part of it in F. So broadly, you want sort of, half of the text you contribute to be investigator capability, bearing in mind there are whole pages devoted to that, which we'll just get to now. But you don't kind of want to underdo any section. So for example, a good rule of thumb might be if investigator capability is 50% and you've got 10 pages for your project description, you probably don't want to spend only half a page on investigator capability. You probably want that first page, maybe that first 2 pages, given what you've also got available in section F, maybe first 3 pages to be about investigator capability. So broadly, so that the application is balanced with regard to the selection criteria. So the last word of advice for the project description is give yourself time. These things are hard to write, and it's a different skill to writing papers. So you want to give it a couple of weeks before the MRO deadline. The MRO does have access to some really good grant writers. So if you are getting in really early, you might get more detailed feedback that's useful. Look at other people's proposals. The MRO provide a bunch of templates, but also get examples from previous grants so that you're not reinventing the wheel every time you need to write a strategic statement. Have your peers read grants, have your supervisors read grants, give them time. So I'll come to section F in a sec. So give your supervisors time to read grants, and good feedback takes time as well. So if you can get done early and give lots of people time to read it, that's going to help out. And try and enjoy it. It's a bit of a bugger, but try and think of it as you're setting out the thing that you most want to do in your career. So when you get Australian Research Council system, there are 3 fellowships you can have: a DECRA, a Future Fellowship, and then a Laureate Fellowship. So this might be, if you stay in Australia, this might be one of the only 3 times you get a chance to write a fellowship application. So make it something you're excited about. Get that excitement to come across. So now part F. Part F has a bunch of little sections in it. So you have an opportunity to describe your interruptions. Use it. So this is not the same as the interruption form, which is about eligibility. This is about giving the panel members and the detailed assessors the opportunity to evaluate your track record relative to opportunity. And if you don't explain the opportunity to them, they can't evaluate it. So I sit on a whole bunch of selection panels as part of my job, and everyone always wants to assess people fairly with regard to opportunity, but you can't do that if the information's not there. So try and make it clear. So if you've had 3 years since your PhD and you worked half-time through those 3 years, say, since completing my PhD, it's been 3 years since I completed my PhD, I worked at 0.5 FTE. Through this period, I have therefore had 1.5 years of research opportunities since I completed my PhD. Do the maths, give them the number. So that then if they go, well, this person has 5 papers and they're 3 years out of PhD, this person has 5 papers and they're 3 years out of PhD, but this person only worked 1.5 years since PhD, this person's done much more in the time that they've had. Don't make them have to wade through and do the maths for you, just give them the number. Like peer review, these systems run on trust. And so as an assessor, I'm not going to phone up the university and get them to justify it. So be honest and put the number there, and then people will take it into account. And over my career, so I finished my PhD in 2004, and over my career, I have seen that these assessments of relative to opportunity are getting better and better and better, and they're much better now. So give them the number. So it talks about, so these are the categories of interruption that are put there. So it spans for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers who have community obligations, illness or injury, carer responsibilities, pregnancy, relocation, time spent employed out of science. So all of these things can be used to contextualize your track record. So the ARC wants that information, give it to them. Okay, so section F17 is 5 pages. So this is your sort of your more standard kind of rope section, which gives you the opportunity to, here we go, the opportunity again to give your time as an active researcher. So you have question, if I flick back, you have F16, where you talk about the interruptions. You can yes or no interruptions. And if the answer is yes, you get 500 characters to describe them. And then when you come to section F17, which is your rope section, you are then given the opportunity to say what your time as an active researcher is. Make that clear. If your time as an active researcher since PhD is 4 years at 0.67 FTE, tell them that and then tell them what that means in terms of time since PhD as an active researcher. Then you have opportunities and achievements and contributions. Oh, I've already done that one. So here's the example sentence. I was awarded my PhD X years ago in whatever year it was. And in that period, I've experienced a total of 2 years of academic interruptions. So this is the example that the ARC give you. I would tack on a following sentence, which then says, I have therefore had XX FTE as an active researcher. Just that sort of flip side of the information that they're providing you an example. Just make it as easy as you possibly can for the panel to understand it. All right. So this is the research opportunities section. So this is the second of those third. Yeah, this is the second of those third sections. So there's a couple of opportunities you get here for different parts of information to provide. So any further information about F16, which we just talked about. Opportunity you've had in the context of your employment situation. So this is where you can talk about periods of un or underemployment. You can talk about employment outside of academia, the research component of your employment conditions. So this is contextualizing that first part of the answer. Description of what your role has been. So if you're in a teaching and research position, you spend 40% of your time doing teaching. This is where your opportunity to divide up your research opportunity into what percentage of time you've spent in the roles. If it's industry-based, the same sort of thing. And it's also probably through here where you would be starting to thinking about highlighting impacts of COVID. So if you are, because of the nature of whatever your job currently is, if you're being called on to do marking or teaching or whatever it is, and you're providing more of your time for that, this is where you can make sure that's clear. You get a chance to describe the research mentoring and research facilities that have been available during your career. So I would try and find, I mean, you want this to try and be positive wherever you can. So it's kind of like the real estate thing, you know, where a small house is cozy. You don't want, so remember that your application is going to be reviewed by academics, mostly teaching and research academics. If you say that your mentoring opportunities have been poor because your supervisor did a lot of teaching and therefore had no time for you, that's not necessarily going to paint your achievements in the best light. So you want it to kind of be, you want to talk about the mentoring that you did have and that you worked independently, that kind of thing. So it's not an opportunity to rag on or complain about your previous experience. It's an opportunity to highlight what mentoring you've had, maybe how that's been beneficial, and what mentoring opportunities you'll have if you get the DECRA. So yeah, try and keep that one positive. I have seen examples of fellowships where the candidates used it as an opportunity to complain that the supervisor was busy and inattentive, and it just didn't come across it didn't come across as helping the candidate, but they rephrased it and then it came across as demonstrating independence, which was cool. And then anything that has impacted you that are relevant and that have not been detailed elsewhere in the application. This is 5 pages maximum. So the RMS system will not allow you to upload a PDF that is longer than 5 pages. So 5 pages max. So this is where you can fill in any other circumstances that have slowed down your research. Let's call a global pandemic, maybe one of those. Maybe the expenditure restrictions that Monash and most other universities are on have prevented you from completing a final piece of work. Things like that can go in that final aspect. And now we get to research achievements and contributions. So this is where you can talk about your contributions to your field. So this is kind of your outputs. So prizes, awards, and honours. Don't take this as confronting if these things have not been awarded to you at this stage of your career. These are the same headings they use for laureates, who are the creme de la creme of Australia's senior researchers. So it's the standard set of headings. So prizes, honours and awards, invited speaker addresses, so keynotes and at conferences, but it could be invitations to talk to other graduate students. It could be departmental seminars. It could be any chance where you've been invited to talk about your research. Income you've received, grants and the like, patents, IP licenses, benefits from those, things that you've done outside of academia. So this is not always just about publications. If your career has been if your research is commercial in confidence and you've written reports that have gone to your industry partners and they have made a widget that's selling billions, cool. Include that sort of thing here. And describe how your research has led to a significant change or advance of knowledge in the field, and outline how your achievements will contribute to this application. So this is, again, that capability aspect. What have you done? How has what you've done changed the field? So what are the contributions you've made, and how is that relevant to this application? And then there's another section, F18, where you describe the publications. So this section is about other things. It's not about your publications. And then F18 is more about your publications. So research context is, I think, quite an important section. So this research context section is where you get to talk about what matters in your field. So how is the assessor, how do they know, or what information can you give them to work out what the most important contributions in your field are? So my examples here are mostly limited to the biological sciences, but hopefully they kind of convey the challenge. So I'm again, an animal physiologist. And so for me, my top discipline journal has an impact factor of 3 for animal physiology. And then the tier above that are the broader disciplines, so ecology, evolution, that sort of thing. And then above that, you're getting into the multidisciplinary journals.
May I have your attention, please? The library will be closing in 30 minutes. All services, including printing and borrowing, need to be finalised within 20 minutes. Thank you for your cooperation.
Nina, I think we just heard whatever that announcement was.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No dramas. I thought it was a question. So yeah, and this allows you to tier them. And so I think this is a really good opportunity because it allows you to tell the reader, so if you're in a discipline, where impact factors are used a lot, you get to tell them, so as an animal physiologist, I get to tell them that the best journal for my field is the Journal of Experimental Biology. So they know that if I'm getting in that journal, I'm doing really well as an animal physiologist. And it allows you to sort of take some of the power away from that sort of impact factor based assessment. It also, even though you put your publications elsewhere, it also allows you to say things like what proportion of your publications are in these kind of journals. So again, if you are focused on journal outputs, you could say that the best journals in topology are these 3 journals, and 75% of my publications are in these journals. So you've done 2 things. You've told them what the best journals are, but more importantly, you've told them how you're doing with respect to those expectations. So this is an opportunity to set the expectations of the assessor and provide some context for how you're meeting them. And then after that, you come down to, oh yeah, and it also allows you to explain authorship practices. So in life sciences, first and last authors carry the most significance. In mathematics, authorship is alphabetical. And so you can explain that so assessors who aren't familiar with this understand. So the question here is, if you change slightly from in field, from PhD to postdoc, are you talking about both? I would say so. So I would say that you could say my research spans 2 disciplines. The top journals in this discipline are these ones. The top journals in this discipline are these ones. That sort of thing. But I guess it's maybe, yeah. So if you're doing a postdoc now, I would say that's the case. If you're moving into a different discipline with the DECRA, you wouldn't need to talk so much about the discipline that you're moving into. It's about your track record, not about your plans. And then, so that provides the context with which the assessors can then go on to evaluate your track record. And so now you move on to F19, which is your research outputs, including your 10 career best. Leave yourself some time to do this. The way that you deal with publications in RNS is painful. It's getting better, but it's still pretty painful and time consuming, and it's definitely do not leave it to the last minute because you will be flinging laptops out the window. It's irksome. So the rope section is research outputs and performance evidence. So wherever you can, you want to use evidence. And so what I'm going to provide now is a couple of examples about how you can use evidence, some of the ways that I've done it. But the way to think about it is that you're getting the opportunity both through your chance to talk about in the previous section what the discipline expectations are, but also you're getting the chance to decide what evidence you're presenting. So you get to decide what the benchmarks you present are. You get to decide what group of people you're comparing. You get to decide what group of people you're not comparing yourself to if that particular comparison is unfavorable. So here I've got this is my Google Scholar page. So I have some words there. Use those words to, you can use, that's one way you can define a candidate set against which you might be compared. So let's see, so body size in my list is pretty broad. Energetics is pretty narrow, scaling is quite narrow. If I was to use energetic scaling, there might be just a very small number of people who use that combination of words. And then I might be able to get a set of individuals where I'm the top ranked person in Australia based on this Google Scholar search. It doesn't matter so much exactly what the Google Scholar search is. What matters is you've defined a set that seems reasonable and puts you in a good light. And I know that this works because I know when I submitted my future fellowship application, I was at a conference with a guy that I know who, a little way in, he asked, are you really the whatever it was person in this field? Are you the best ranked or the most in Australia or whatever it was? And that was 9 months after the application had been submitted. He asked me that question, and I know that the only place he could possibly have gotten it was my future fellowship application. So he remembered that for 9 months. And it sounded much more impressive than it was because I defined the candidate set in a way that made me look probably better than I actually am. So use the best evidence that you can. So you can use a Google Scholar keyword search. You could use a Web of Science keyword search. That's one of the ones I use because you can combine keywords. So for me, metabolic rate's pretty broad. Metabolic rate is pretty broad. scaling is pretty broad, but metabolic rate and scaling is narrow. And I look good against that. You could maybe define where you've previously set up that list of discipline journals, maybe because you've had 3 papers in that narrow set of leading discipline journals in the last 12 months, you're the person who's the most published non-professor by that search. Again, it's a narrow search, but if you say, I'm the most published early career researcher in the world in the last 3 years, in the last year, in the discipline leading journal, the Journal of Experimental Biology, that sounds really grandiose, but it's actually a very narrow set. So that can work quite well. If you've got lots of papers in Nature and Science, mention them. If you're consistently hitting discipline journals rather than Nature and Science, great. Make sure you use that publication context and contribution so that the assessors know what the best discipline journals are, remembering that you get to tell them what the best discipline journals are, and then you tell them that you're publishing in those journals. If you've got papers in journals that tend to have lower impact factors, so these could be, so again, in biological sciences, ornithology and entomology, because those journals tend to have lower citations, you could check the field-weighted citation impact of your paper against that discipline, and maybe you're really well cited for an ornithologist or for a particular discipline. So that's another way that if you're using those particular sets of journals, because they're the appropriate ones for you, you can say that you're doing better than the set that you are compared to. And you could do a comparison with other DECRA recipients. So if all of the DECRA recipients are named on RMS, you could work out how you sit relative to a relevant comparative set. But certainly I don't want this to be about you thinking that it's important to hit all of these. You need 4 papers in Nature and Science, 27 papers in your top discipline journals, and you need to be the most published author in your discipline in Oceania for the last 27 years. This is really just about using the most appropriate tools to show what it is about your career achievements that sets you apart from some peers. So it's about making sure that you present your CV in the best light using the evidence that you've got available to you. Now we come on to the boring bits, costing and justifying your budget. This is important. Remember, the panel don't like it if you're gouging money. They want things to be justified. So make sure that you separate things appropriately across the categories. It's important where possible to put something under each of these categories. So there's a trick in the way that the ARC does budgets, in that you will ask for a certain amount of money. They will then not give you that money. That will free you up to spend the money in a slightly different way to how you propose to spend it. But the restriction will be, if you didn't put any items in equipment, then when the ARC funds your project, if there's no items in equipment, you are never allowed to spend money that would categorize as equipment. So if you have a little bit in personnel, maybe a little bit of casual research support from a PhD student or something, a little bit of travel for conferences, field research if you think you might do it, a little bit of equipment if you might need to buy some maintenance and consumables, whatever. It allows you some more flexibility later on. Make sure you use the same headings when you're justifying the budget so that you can match your justifications to the line items that you present in the budget. And it needs to be in terms of need and cost, not just this cost $10,000 and we got 3 quotes and the best was $10,000. It's about, why do you need that? Why does the government need to spend 10 grand on this piece of thing so that you can do this research? Justifying major items of equipment is not such an issue in DECRA because the budgets are relatively small, but you need to justify why these equipments need to be purchased, and you need to say why you're doing travel. So international travel might be to forge those international alliances that you've talked about earlier on, for example. And then we come to the other elements of the proposal. So these are sort of the front end bits. So part A, you have your title, your summary, and your national interest. remembering that these are used to generate a word cloud, and this can have important impacts on who your assessors are. So badly, I leave these to the last minute, or I leave these to the last thing to do, and so they're often not as polished as they should be. So don't do what Donnie Don't does. Make sure you spend some time to get these right, because they can affect the outcome through who your assessors are. They can also affect the outcome through whether the minister decides to sign off or not. And then you have very specific application summary requirements. So the application summary needs to follow a particular format. And again, this is because the ARC might use it. It's how the minister will consider the application, and they expect to see it in a consistent format. If you don't follow this format, MRO will send it back to you and they will tell you to follow this format. So you might as well just start there. So this information comes from the ARC website. And you can see examples of application summaries for funded projects on the ARC website as well. Okay, and then there's just some more advice here about making sure that you follow the rules, the requirements for that summary. But also there's a little bit here, which is an important step consideration, which is when you're describing the benefits of the project, ensure that the description is consistent with the ARC medical research policy. So you can't say, even if your research might have future application in understanding and combating the obesity epidemic, you've got to be very careful about how you say that in your application summary, because if your research is about human obesity, it probably is going to fall on the medical research side, and then your grant will be excluded as non-eligible because of the ARC medical research policy. So you do need to be a little bit careful there and make sure that when you're talking about the benefits, you're talking about the benefits such that they are within the bounds of that policy. So be careful about medical research in that section. And then the national interest test statement is also that quick statement, 750 to 1125 characters, about why Australia should care. If you're talking to someone at the supermarket about this and they find out what you're doing, how is it that you're going to convince them that their tax dollars are appropriately spent on this? Why should they be paying for it? Why shouldn't they just have that money in their pocket? Why should Australia fund this research? And remember, it's potential to have economic, commercial, environmental, social, cultural benefits. So we understand what the ARC is. Fundamental research is important to the ARC, but you also want to think about what the benefits are with regard to national interest. And you want to be able to articulate those. Then you come to your field of research. So these are the codes that dictate, that define the scope of your research project. So I think you're allowed to put up to 3. Yes, you are. And you're allowed to attribute them in different percentages. So I'm quite careful with these in that I want them to be sent. I use the field that I think is going to be most receptive. So if my project spans 2 disciplines, but the research is taking sort of old techniques from the second discipline and applying them in a new way to my discipline, I would send it to my discipline because that's much more exciting for my discipline than it is for the other discipline, or vice versa. So use the ones that are likely to be most receptive to it. And then often the socioeconomic objectives come down to understanding new knowledge, that sort of thing. So again, there's a big list, find the ones that are most appropriate. There's education and training in there, things like that, expanding knowledge. So mine might often spread among expanding knowledge in the biological sciences and education of PhD students, that kind of stuff. And that is it. My goodness, I ran almost to 5. So I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat while I'm waiting for anyone to do that. If you do have sort of, eligibility and other type questions, the faculty research officer there, the Monash research officer there, There's a lot of expertise in both of those offices to help you with this sort of stuff. Trying to navigate the ARC webpage is difficult, even for those of us who do it all the time. So trying to find those dates for eligibility, I found really difficult and very annoying. So don't be disheartened trying to wade through all of the information that you need to get, and do reach out for help and support if you need it, either from the Faculty Research Office, the Monash Research Office, from your supervisors and from your schools, and make sure you get examples to sort of help you get through that first phase. Things like the administering organisation statement. Certainly don't try and start one of those from scratch. A lot of people have put a lot of effort into getting them to a reasonably good state. Use that as a springboard. Okay. You're welcome to everyone. And more sessions for the first page at a later date. So we're all full up. If people want to do that, email the faculty, the SciDash Research email account, and we will keep a list, and then we will organise another session.
There's 2 on the waiting list at the moment. So.
Okay, 2 on the waiting. So we'll build up some, and then we'll do it again. Yes, the slides will be made available. The video will be made available. Moira's notes will be made available. And yeah, there's a bunch of people here to help. Use your schools. Feel free to email me, craig.white@monash.edu. And if there's no more questions, then I hope everyone's doing all right during this stage 4. I'm finding it quite sucky. Just about had enough of this, but cases have dropped. Active cases are down 200 today, 200 yesterday. So hopefully we are on track for stage 4 to end and us well leave the house. So stay safe, everyone, and best of luck with the writing. And I'll see some of you on Friday to talk about the first-ish page of your project description.
Just on that point, Craig and Anna, I've emailed MRO to check on the eligibility. If that comes back that I'm not eligible, I've got a spot on Friday, so I'll make sure to let you know to free that up.
Okay.
That'd be great.
Thanks.
I hope that you are eligible. And
I have a feeling I won't be, but that's life.
Okay. Cool. Thanks all. Take care.
Okay. Bye. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Anna.